Jim Tucker is a professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia, where he's also the director of the Division of Perceptual Studies. He's most well known for his work studying cases of children who seem to recall memories from a previous life. He's written 2 books on the subject, Return to Life and Life Before Life, both of which can be found in his 2-in-1 book, Before: Children's Memories of Previous Lives. Jim's work studying this phenomenon, which was formerly carried out by Dr. Ian Stevenson, is incredibly compelling, shockingly convincing, and wildly unacknowledged by the mainstream. Please see the description for links and timestamps. We hope you enjoy the interview. So, Jim, to start us off, can you please tell me a little bit about your background and about how you first became interested in the phenomenon of children who seem to recall memories of a previous life?
Sure. Well, I'm a child psychiatrist, and after medical school, I came to the University of Virginia to do my residency training and then a fellowship in child psychiatry. While I was here, I heard about the former chairman of the department, this guy named Ian Stevenson, who had stepped down as chairman to focus on children's memories of past lives, which I thought was interesting, but I never met him. And after I finished my training, I went into private practice in child psychiatry. And then by the time I got to my early to mid 30s, private practice was going well, and I was busy to the point of being too busy, really, and it was certainly time consuming and energy consuming, but not completely fulfilling. And then when my wife and I got together, she's a psychologist who was interested in things like reincarnation and psychic abilities and so forth, which kind of got me intrigued. And I started reading up on such things. And I was reading one of Ian Stevenson's books when we saw in the local newspaper that his research division had gotten a grant to do a new study on near-death experiences. So I called them up to see if they needed any help interviewing patients for it. And that kind of got my foot in the door. I started volunteering an hour or 2 a week with them. And then over time, put in more time. And then Ian asked if I was interested in going to Asia, meeting one of the colleagues there and studying cases of children talking about past lives. So my interest in it went from the general to the specific. I mean, I was quite intrigued by this effort here at UVA to explore the question of consciousness being separate from the brain or surviving after the brain dies. And in particular, this question of, is there a part of us that survives after we die? And then it happened to be that the opening really was in the children's past life memory cases. Ian at that point was approaching 80 and continued to work for a while. But so I came on half-time for a year and then came on full-time in the year 2000. And I've been doing it ever since, as well as I continue to be a child psychiatrist and seeing patients and supervising trainees and all that. But I also do this research.
Yeah, that's no wonder you're as busy as you are, as I keep hearing from your colleagues, that you don't have a second to yourself. But wow, that's fascinating. So before you met your wife and before you kind of crossed paths with Ian Stevenson, were you a physicalist, a materialist? Did you have any intrigue already into these areas, or what was your state of mind in that sense?
Well, I would say that my sort of religious, spiritual kind of beliefs were quiescent. I mean, I had been religious, going to church every week growing up. I wasn't religiously active as an adult. But there was still this piece of me that was intrigued by that. When I was an undergrad in college, one of the psychology professors recommended a book on near-death experiences, so I had read that. So it was just a mild interest along with other interests, but it really didn't get stirred until I learned about all this.
Yeah. Okay. So you're kind of fairly normal with a good chunk of open-mindedness in there, rather than hardcore materialist. Not that approach.
Well, that's right. I mean, I would say I'm always skeptical of phenomena that ask for an extraordinary explanation, but still open to considering it.
Yeah, absolutely. And skeptical in the proper sense of the word, the true sense of the word, questioning and curious, as you say.
Yeah.
So you committed your career to it. Well, I guess when you first took on that role, when Ian was leaving, you probably didn't realize that you'd stay there for as long as you have. But was there a tipping point in terms of your interest in the phenomena and how much, I don't want to use the word belief because I know this, we kind of follow the evidence, but was there a tipping point in terms of when you felt like, wow, I'm now all in this, I can commit my career to this? And was there a tipping point where you became convinced beyond doubt of the veracity of this phenomenon?
Well, I would say the tipping point actually was, once I took this job, I was all in. I stopped my private practice, and again, I continue to see patients. So it's not like I stopped clinical work, but I immediately started devoting a lot of time to this research. Not because I thought I had the answers, but just because I thought it was so great asking the questions and, trying to explore, can we take a serious-minded approach to this question? Is there evidence that part of us can survive death? And I wouldn't say that I would ever get sort of beyond a reasonable doubt exactly, but I think having been in this business now, studying these cases for coming up on 25 years, I don't see an easy way to dismiss them. I think if you look at the strongest cases as a group, that they provide pretty solid evidence that at least in some cases, children do have knowledge in a way that appears to be memories of a past life. Now, that doesn't automatically equal reincarnation, but I think there's something substantial there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a way, the weaker cases have a part to play too, in the sense that there probably are so many more of them. And it might just be those little anecdotes here and there where people say to you, oh, Jim, yeah, my son said this once and then never mentioned it again. And it was really bizarre and out of character. And all those little things kind of add up to this jigsaw. I think they create the greater picture of how widespread this could be, in fact. These cases, I think they're so compelling. I think you illustrated them so well in this book, your 2-in-1 book before. Of course, we have convincing statements. We have convincing potential memories that children say out loud and what have you. But can you talk about the other key evidential areas for this phenomenon, such as, behaviors that the child may display, recognition, birthmarks, and a few other bits and bobs? Can you talk a little bit give people that are maybe less familiar with it a kind of bigger picture view of this phenomenon?
Yeah. As far as statements go, of course, like you say, they're kind of the core of the phenomenon, where children, in the most impressive cases, will give a number of details about somebody who they and the family had never heard of before. And then when people go and check, they find that, in fact, it matches somebody who lived and died in the past. But it's not just a case of information. The behaviors at times can be quite pronounced, and they can include a real emotional component where some of these kids are crying on a daily basis, basically begging their parents to take them to their previous family. And sometimes they'll say, "You're not my parents. My real parents live in such and such place." That they really seem to be mourning at times the lost relationships. In the 70% of cases where the previous person died by unnatural means, a lot of those kids, about 35%, will show a phobia toward the mode of death. So, for example, there was a little girl where basically from the time she was born, she hated being in water. Would take 3 adults to hold her down to give her a bath when she was an infant. And then when she got old enough to talk, described the life and death of a girl from another village who had drowned in an accident. So that's something that we see a lot, this really intense fear, which will often get better as the kids get older. We'll also see in their play a lot of times themes that seem connected to the past life they're describing, where they will play compulsively hours and hours at one particular thing, most often the occupation of the previous person. And it can be where it kind of at times kind of takes over their lives, where they refuse to do anything else except play at this occupation. Occasionally we've had cases where in the play they would be reenacting the death of the previous person, which would be kind of grisly for the parents to watch. So there's certainly a lot of behavioral aspects to this. In addition, there at times are even birthmarks and birth defects of these kids. They'll be born with these that match wounds, usually the fatal wound on the body of the previous person. And Ian Stevenson published a 2,000-page work where he documented over 200 such cases, where the in addition to talking about a past life, the child will have a physical representation from it. So he listed 18 cases where the child was born with two birthmarks, ones that matched both the entrance wound and the exit wound on the body of a gunshot victim. And then some of the, full-blown defects, missing limbs, missing digits, a lot of very pronounced birth defects that again match the child's memories of a past life.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, those the various areas, the birthmarks particularly so. I can't remember, what was Ian Stevenson's book called on it? Was it Biology and Reincarnation?
Reincarnation and Biology is the full 2-volume, 2,000-pager. And then he did write a synopsis as well called Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect, which is much more manageable for a lot of people to read.
Yeah. And so, you've got those areas of play, you've got the statements, the memories, you've got the birthmarks. And then you also have a recognition, right, where these children will meet who the previous family, they think the previous family may have been, or whoever the investigators might think it is. And often they'll have, again, like a tearful reunion or, something like that.
Right. And with those, they come in different categories. A lot of the families in Asia, which is where Ian found most of his cases, they would locate who they thought was the previous person, and then they'd have a meeting with the child, say with the previous person's mother. The problem was that those tests were completely uncontrolled, and there may have been a lot of cues that the people gathered around would give to kind of lead the child to pick the correct person. Now, sometimes when they did that, like you say, there'd be a lot of emotion involved. And sometimes they would then give information about the person or about the family that they could not have known by just looking at them. There are also cases where it's sort of spontaneous recognitions where say the previous person was from a nearby village and the family would run into them and the child would say, oh, there's Aunt so-and-so or, whatever, and recognize the person, which even though it's uncontrolled, in a way is more impressive than the ones where it was planned. But then there are the controlled ones. And recently what I've been doing is showing kids pictures from the past life, where I'll show initially I would show them a lineup of pictures, but unfortunately it was for a 4 or 5-year-old, 5 or 6-year-old, showing them like 4 pictures in a row is too much for them to take in. So what I started doing is I showed them pairs of pictures, one from the past life, the other one a control picture, and to see if they could pick out which was the correct picture. And there's one case that is in the intro of the new before version, where I showed a child 8 pairs of pictures. 2 of them he didn't make a choice on, but the others was 6 out of 6. So that beats the odds that someone could do that just by chance.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well. I mean, it's obviously not evidential that he doesn't guess on the ones that he doesn't guess on, but
Right.
it's interesting at least.
Yeah.
He's not trying to just throw something at the wall and hope it sticks. He's like,
Right.
don't recognize those people, and that is what it is. Yeah, such a fascinating and bizarre phenomenon. Could you maybe expand a little bit more on the birthmark cases and talk a little bit about experimental birthmarks as well, which I think are particularly interesting and the strange element of this phenomenon. And it would also be great if you could share maybe what is, in your opinion, the strongest case of birthmark reincarnation.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I necessarily have a top 10, but there are certainly some impressive ones. Like there was one where the previous person that was identified died by a shotgun blast to the side of his head, killed by a neighbor who said he mistook him for a rabbit, which kind of a weird story, but in any event. And then the boy was born with just a stub for an ear and an underdeveloped right side of his face. So that was quite a spectacular, if I may use that word, birth defect that matched with his memories and matched with the previous wounds. There's another case where a little boy had lost the fingers of his right hand in a fodder chopping machine. And then a number of years later, a child was born in another village who had memories of his life and also was born without digits on his right hand, or just stubs for fingers, which is quite an unusual birthmark. The one hand is perfectly normal, and then the other one just has stubs for fingers.
Yeah.
Case of a little girl who remembered the life of a man who had gotten his fingers chopped off as he was being murdered, and the little girl was born with very deformed fingers. So, we get these certainly impressive looking birth defects that just happen to be match the memories of past life that child's describing.
Because I should point out to people watching and listening, because they might not, people that haven't read this or looked into this in much detail might not realize, but the cases to which you're referring now, and most of the birthmark cases, or the stronger birthmark cases, they are cases that are strong cases of reincarnation or of past life memories without the birthmarks. It's just we have that as like a cherry on the cake almost. It's like they have the statements in the first. It's not like the other way around, like, oh, that birthmark matches, how my brother died, I'm going to try and make that fit. It's the other way around.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And they get kind of hard to explain. I mean, when I first learned about this phenomenon of the birthmarks and birth defects, frankly, I was a little skeptical that a wound on one body would then show up somehow as a wound on the developing fetus. I mean, even if you believe in reincarnation. But what I think came to believe, and what Ian described as well, is that it's not literally the wound on the previous body that carries over. It's the sort of the mental image or mental trauma of that wound that gets carried over. So we know from work in other areas that at times mental images can produce very specific effects on the body and particularly susceptible people. So you can hypnotize some people and produce blisters when you tell them you're touching them with a hot poker and you just touch them with your finger, various things like that. So at times, mental images produce specific results. Well, if you accept the idea, or you're open to the idea that consciousness from one person can continue on, then in this case, it would be that they took those images, the consciousness took the images with them. And then when it inhabited the developing fetus, it produced the marks just like someone under hypnosis. And, in this case, it's as the fetus is developing, so it's not going to be a blister that just goes away, but unfortunately at times can kind of permanently deform the development of the child.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of wrap our head around like how that works and stuff. But it's it is fascinating. When I spoke to your colleague, Dr. Ed Kelly, he mentioned a few cases of like a lady standing in the field, a pregnant lady sees her brother get his hand mangled in some farm machinery, and lo and behold, her baby comes out with a mangled, deformed hand, the same hand. And like you mentioned about the blisters, like I think Ed also gave me the example of hypnosis with somebody that had been kidnapped, and when they were retelling it, their rope burns started to be visible on their wrists and things like that, which is
that's quite
so fascinating. Yeah.
But yeah, the other, as far as seeing a brother with mangled hand, or even worse, it was what's called maternal impression, which back in the 1800s there were physicians publishing in medical journals these cases, and the assumption was at the time that the traumatic experience of seeing those things then produced it in the child. That then got discarded, partly because there was no physical explanation for how that would happen. So then they were just kind of, and there was a lack of awareness of the potential interplay between mother and fetus. And I mean, the concept has never been accepted since then. So the cases are just written off as a coincidence. But some of them are pretty unlikely coincidences. Because you've got some incredibly rare defects that just happen to match something that the mother saw. Another aspect you asked about with the birthmarks is what Ian called experimental birthmarks. And this is a practice, I guess it's still going on. It was 20 years ago when I was over in Asia. And in parts of Asia, there's this practice where when somebody dies, someone will make a mark on the body, usually with like soot or paste or something like that. And with the idea being that the spirit, or whatever they call it, would then carry that mark with them to their next birth so that they could be identified as having come back. Ian collected a couple of dozen of those cases. Jürgen Kyle, a colleague, he and I collected another 18. And I mean, they're hard to dismiss. I mean, it looks like something strange has happened, where you get this match where no one else has birthmarks like that, and suddenly this kid appears with one. And sometimes then, as they get older, they will talk about that past life. Others, they don't. So it's hard to know, hard to have a definitive answer about what's going on there.
Yeah. Really fascinating though, because I think from memory, it seems like they sometimes will do it straight after the death, immediately after the death, and sometimes it could even be a few days after the death.
Right.
And yet still, it seems like in some cases, again, it's hard to say with any certainty, but it looks like and it seems like somebody's coming back and having that birthmark, and it seems to be not a coincidence.
Well, that's right. And usually when they do it, they sort of say a prayer or make a wish that the person carry the mark with them. So there may be this interplay between consciousness and the physical, that it could even involve the consciousness of the marker that is producing it, and some weird link with the consciousness of the person who has died and then perhaps carried on later.
Yeah. Have you come across any of those cases in the Western world, or is it's always been?
I haven't had a case where someone has marked a body. We've certainly had birthmark and birth defect cases in the States, but not the markings. If we ever did, it would be good if people could get a little more creative with the markings. I mean, usually in Asia, it's just, like a thumbprint or whatever. And if you got shapes that came back, that would be more impressive.
Yeah, definitely. Let's do like a love heart in lipstick on under the arm or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
A star shape or a name, even just sign it and we'll see. But yeah, those cases, when I read those in your book, I mean, that kind of was yeah, hard to deal with that. Yeah, definitely the boggle threshold was tested for a moment there. But as you say, the results, they don't, it's not just nonsense that you've put in the book to be like, oh, there's one case of this that was maybe, like, there's quite a number of cases and they're quite compelling. So it's really, bizarre aspect of this phenomenon. But yeah, wow. So how many cases would you say you've kind of researched or looked into at this point? Hundreds, maybe 1,000 or more?
Well, we've got over 2,000 in our database, but those include Ian as well as some outside researchers. For me, it's in the hundreds. I don't know how many, but
yeah, okay, number of hundreds.
Yeah, and then we also, I mean, we hear from 120 American families a year. That's what we average of where they're emailing us usually to say that their kids remembered a past life. No, we don't study all those cases because, I mean, what we're interested in is, are there cases that have the potential to provide evidence of a carryover from a previous life, which means identifying who the previous person was. And the child has to give the right details for that to be possible. So, there are some kids who just have vivid images, including often terrible, tragic deaths. But if they don't give names of people or places, then with occasional exception where the death is so unusual. But if they don't give names, then it's impossible for us to, or for anyone, to verify that it was actually a past life. So then we don't know, is it just imagination, odd imagination, but some sort of fantasy on the part of the child. But if all their statements match somebody who actually died, then, we know it's more than just fantasy.
Yeah. Can I get the latest update as well on how many cases you would say there are at DOPS? I think the last I heard was about 2,700, and is that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you score it. I mean, there are some cases whereas we decided, 20 years ago now, to create a database where we put all the information of all the cases. We code them up 200 variables, put them into the database, and it's taken us almost up to now to get them all in. But as we did that, there were some cases that now we would not register or not put it, we'd register it. We would not include them in the database that were included earlier. So we studied more cases than what we now consider official cases, which is kind of a rambling way of not quite answering your question. But it's as far as cases we studied, then somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000. We've got to think about 2,300 in the database.
Yeah. Wow. And I guess of the ones particularly that you've studied personally and that you've looked into in some detail, would you say, I know you said earlier you don't really have a top 10 of birthmark cases, but if I kind of put you on the spot a little bit, it doesn't have to be the number one and the number two, but which kind of one or two cases jump out at you as maybe some of the most compelling or convincing cases? And again, I know the whole point of this phenomenon, as with the case for survival in general, it's the body of evidence that's the most compelling aspect. But yeah, if we break it down to one or two individual cases, what would you kind of plant your flag on?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I took a couple of three trips, I think, to Asia to study cases, but then I decided to focus on American cases. And that was around the time that the internet was getting going and we started hearing from more American families. So the two that I've studied that I think provide the best evidence would be James Leininger, who talked about being an American pilot killed in World War II, and Ryan Hammonds, who talked about being a Hollywood extra. And both of those, we got some pretty impressive confirmation that their memories did match somebody who died.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's probably quite a lot of information on both of those cases online. So if anybody wants to learn more, just Google those two names, Ryan Hammonds and James Leininger. And as we talked about briefly before the interview, I've spoken to James's dad, Bruce, for this podcast, so people can watch that as well. 2-hour kind of deep dive with Bruce. He kind of goes through the whole story. Jim probably gets mentioned quite a few times in that. What about lesser known cases? Could you kind of mention one or two lesser known cases that are maybe in their own way still very compelling, and you would still kind of feel comfortable bringing them up to somebody that was, quite skeptical or doubting?
Yeah. Well, the recent one that I mentioned a few minutes ago is this little boy who started talking about being in a war and talked about being in the jungle and also on the beach. And his parents asked him when that was, and he said, I think I've got this right. He said 69, and they said 1969, and he said yeah, and they said was it Vietnam, and he said it was, and gave a number of details, including his last name from that life, and also the state that he was from. So his mom went online, found a website for the Vietnam Memorial, and was shocked to see that there was a guy with this last name from the state that the kid had given. And it's an unusual last name. He also gave the age when he died. He said he was 21, and this guy had been 21 when he died. So mom, by her report, didn't investigate that guy anymore, but what she did was she investigated the question of past life memories, and she found us, and then she emailed us. So I went to meet with the family, perfectly reasonable people. And I brought with me some pictures from the previous guy's life. So what I did was, it took a fair amount of detective work, actually, but I joined I got a free month subscription to a newspaper database online. So I was able to access the previous person's obituary. And from that, there was enough where I could then trace various things about him, including his address when he was in high school and the high school he went to. So when I visited the family, I brought with me some pictures, including a picture of the previous person's house. Now, I got these from, Google Street View. So I don't know how the houses have changed, and this would have been, so the guy was killed in 69, I think. And, I was accessing them a couple of years ago, so I don't know how the house may have changed in 50 years. But in any event, I showed him a picture of the previous person's house along with a control picture, and also from Google Street View. And he didn't say that he remembered either one. But then I also showed him a picture of the house across the street, as well as a control picture. And that one, he did pick out the correct one. And then I showed him pictures from two high schools. Central High School is the name of where he went. So two central high schools from the same part of the country. And he said he remembered going in the correct one. So afterwards, I kept doing research, and by, it's almost hard to believe, but by being a member of classmates.com, I was able to access this guy's high school yearbook from the year he graduated from high school. And so what I did was sent mom pairs of pictures, one of the school administrators, principal, vice principal, and so forth, one of teachers, and one of students, that did not include a picture of the previous person because he had seen that picture, but from other students in the same class. And along with a 1968 yearbook from a different central high school. And so I sent those pairs of pictures. And the best part about this test was send them by email, and then mom would show them to the child. She didn't know which was the correct one either. So he wasn't picking up on cues from her, but he picked out the correct picture for all three of those. And when I wrote mom back and said that they were all correct, she was blown away. And she said, she couldn't believe it. And he was so casual as he would pick the correct one. So then I wrote to the previous man's sister, and her daughter, so in other words, his niece, wrote me back and sent some family photos. So I showed him photos of each parent with the control. And it wasn't a great picture of the mom, but it's what I had. And he did not make a selection with the mom, but he picked the correct one for the father. And then he said he was tired of looking at pictures, which, I understood. But so again, there were 8 pairs of pictures in all that I showed him, and he didn't make a selection for 2, but the others he was 6 out of 6. And, if you do the odds, I mean, that's like flipping a coin and having it come up heads 6 out of 6 times. I mean, it's possible, but it's certainly unlikely. And that added to the, getting the names and everything else correct. So it's, in its own way, it's an impressive case. And so I'm the internet's a double-edged sword for us. I mean, the advantage is, like in that case, I was able to find these pictures and find this information. It also means that an industrious enough parent, could do more things. So we have to consider that possibility. But it does give us a better chance of being able to do recognition tests than what we've had in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned in there about how you're kind of like an investigator, and that's probably a big part of the job, of what you do and researching into these cases, because you're constantly like trying to add things together and find clues and chase up leads and everything. What were you going to say?
And it's like being a detective in the sense that detectives should not close their minds to just one possibility too quickly. You do have to keep an open mind. So I approach every case with an open question. What is the evidence here of a link to this past life? So I'm trying to get as much as possible. And in that case, the more I got, the stronger it locked.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the internet and how the double-edged sword and how it kind of the negative effect of it is that there's more of a chance for parents to be able to access this information, and even though it doesn't give a motivation necessarily, it gives them the possibility to fake one of these cases or to exaggerate one of these cases. And that brings me on to my next question, and it's that a year or two ago, let's go 2 years ago, I was probably no idea about these stuff, right? These cases, I was probably completely closed off to it. If somebody had 2.5 years maybe. But if somebody had mentioned, reincarnation, I would have completely switched off and thought, wow, that's madness. And I guess as much as most of my audience here, or most of the people watching and listening, will be pretty open-minded, I think there's probably a few people who are thinking like I used to think, and hopefully we haven't already lost them. But in assuming they're still here, could you maybe talk through what some of the possible normal explanations could be for these cases, and why you believe there isn't a normal explanation that fits why normal explanations cannot explain away the enormity of the body of these cases, like all of these cases in combination? Because individually it seems like, that could be this or that could be that, and that's a combination of fantasy and lying. But when you look at them all together, it becomes very hard to do that. So can you talk a little bit about the normal explanations and why they don't fit?
Yeah, I mean, one explanation that we've been alluding to would be fraud. I mean, out and out fraud. And actually, Ian published a paper on, deception and self-deception. But I mean, occasionally there are cases that we get concerned about. And in Asia, there were some where the child's family was asking the previous family for money. And especially if the previous person had been wealthy or renowned or whatever, then you have to wonder about that. I think self-deception is more likely, where especially with famous figures, where there are times parents become convinced that their child was somebody famous. Ian published a case where the father was convinced that the child had been John Kennedy in the past life, and actually named the child Kennedy. The father was a huge fan of John Kennedy and named the child that, and then thought he was JFK. But when Ian looked into it, I mean, the child had no knowledge beyond what common knowledge that a lot of people would have.
Yeah, especially somebody whose father is obsessed with the
right,
person.
exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I'm very skeptical of cases of past lives of famous people. We don't get those that often, but there are times that we do, and I think they warrant an extra dose of skepticism. Again, not that it's intentional fraud, just like we get reports from adults of being Marilyn Monroe or Thomas Jefferson. Those are most popular, and I think that people are likely, almost certainly, in most cases, kind of fooling themselves.
Wishful thinking.
Yeah, and so there's that. But for most of our cases, the child is describing just an ordinary person who lived an ordinary life, and there seems to be no motivation to intentionally create this. I mean, the parents certainly don't get anything out of it. And then in the strongest cases, fraud would be essentially impossible because the information was not available until people started doing some serious digging in ways that the family could not have done. So fraud, if it happens, as far as we can tell, is exceedingly rare. Another explanation, which is a little more likely, would be that it's kind of fantasy plus coincidence. So that the child says they remember a past life, and just kind of by chance that lines up with somebody who lived before. And these things are hard to quantify. In fact, it's kind of impossible to quantify. But in the strongest cases, I mean, it seems preposterous to me that it would be purely coincidence. I mean, when you get 50 details that match, I mean, I don't think that's coincidence. Then you've got, and this is a more serious criticism, most of Ian's cases, nobody wrote down what the child was saying before they went to look for the previous person. So then the concern is, once the families met and they exchanged information, completely accidentally, but the parents started started crediting the child with more specific information than what they actually gave. And, that's something that we're always aware of. And it seems more likely in the culture with a belief in reincarnation. And I mean, there are what we call same family cases, where there's a deceased family member. And then, you've got real wishful thinking that can play into it as well. But we've got dozens of cases now where the people did write down what the child said. And so before anyone went looking for the previous person, so we know that it was not a false memory on the part of the witnesses, but instead the child did have this information, then it did fit with somebody who lived and died in the past. So, I mean, those are kind of the typical normal explanations that are given, and none of them can explain all of the cases, and not to mention the birthmarks and birth defects. So I think we are fully warranted in considering explanations that are not ordinary or not normal. That I mean, we don't typically use the term paranormal, but something that we don't have an explanation for that's going on, and one that's not physicalist, materialist, but more of a phenomenon of consciousness.
Yeah, potentially as simple as, the common conception of reincarnation, or maybe a much more nuanced, complicated version of the same idea. But really, really interesting. And obviously then there's like the non-normal potential explanation, which kind of maybe we can talk about a bit later. It's like the super psi versus survival, unlimited psychic, abilities versus whether it's just simply the survival of death. In terms of that, I think there are elements where it could explain things, but I struggle personally. Super psi and birthmarks. Like, I think, again, if you really want to go down the idea of super, like underlined in bold, like the idea of there being no limits, to psi, then I suppose you could quite easily make the argument that the parent, knew on some level that this was, I don't know. It feels like a kind of grabbing at straws, but possible.
Yeah, it gets pretty far-fetched. So yeah, I mean, super psi, the idea that psychic abilities, which we have a pretty good idea from decades of work in parapsychology, it does seem to be beyond chance that people, and at times they can be impressive, the premonitions or those sorts of things. But for a young child who shows no other evidence of any psychic abilities to have this profound knowledge of a past life that includes, again, not just information, but where it's from the vantage point of one person and includes all the emotional components. I mean, that alone, I think, I mean, it's a real stretch. And then, with the birthmarks, where then you've got, okay, well, who caused that? Was it that the parents' psychic abilities and somehow the child's fetus picked up on her, or, and the memories, how did the memories get there? I mean, it just gets, again, sort of Occam's razor argues against it, but I mean, sometimes things do require complicated explanations. And like you said a minute ago, this realm of consciousness, if it is there, is probably more complicated or complex than our brains can ever fully comprehend, and it may well not work in a linear way, the way that we think of things working. So it's there's a great unknown there, but there is this evidence that again there is a consciousness, that it is a phenomenon of consciousness and not just a materialist kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to ask you a few questions soon about elements that do like kind of amplify or highlight how strange and hard to keep track of this whole thing, and what was I going to say? Yeah, just on the super psi versus survival. Yeah, you highlighted it well in your book, and I think you just mentioned it now, is the emotions of how the child attaches himself to that previous life doesn't really make sense in terms of psi. It's not that it would be impossible, it's that it doesn't really make sense. It could make sense that if there was some kind of connection, they could have access to that person's thoughts or whatever, or knowledge, but to actually associate themselves as that person and to show visible, raw emotions based upon that connection, it feels like too much.
You can make the case. So if you get memories of a life that are implanted in your brain, well, then you may, if you feel like you lived it before, then the emotions may be there, even if you didn't. So argument can be made, but it does get rather convoluted.
Yeah, like a glitch in the psi network. There's like psi working with very strong effects accidentally, like because it's clearly not supposed to work exactly like that. Right. So going from some stats and of your DOPS cases. So I think you mentioned earlier that about 70% of the cases died by unnatural means, or 70% of the previous personality died by unnatural means. And also what we find from your cases is that children are more likely to remember a previous life that ended young. So we have the highest number of the cases of people that died early, and then gradually, as the age of death increases, the number of cases you have in your archive decreases. Tell me if I'm going wrong at any point, because this was kind of hard to...
Yeah, so unnatural deaths or violent deaths is one category, and dying young is actually a separate, is independent variable. So when we look at just the natural death cases, we see that they also die young. So unnatural deaths tend to be...
That's what I meant. Sorry, just I probably muddled it in how I got it.
But it's important to know that both of those operate separately. So what do you make of that? So why is it that people who die young or die violently are more likely to, their details are more likely to show up in a child's memories in the future? And what it suggests is there's something about that death that maybe short circuits the process isn't quite right, but leads the memories to kind of stick with them as opposed to fading like they seem to do for most of us. Or, I mean, another view would be that the consciousness stays more attached to this world, this realm, because of that sudden violent death. So then when the consciousness attaches to, maybe those are the only ones where the consciousness does attach to a new person. Maybe the rest of us don't have any past lives. I mean, that would be a possibility. So it's an interesting, I mean, you can come up with various scenarios that make sense with the data that we see.
Yeah, definitely. It's like you can look at it in the sense of like, if we live a long and peaceful life and we die, old and contented, we're less likely to remember that life. Is that because, lack of trauma or anything like that? But then, or are we less likely to be reincarnated in the first place? And you can kind of go either way with it. And of course we could find many more nuanced, like, potential ways to speculate about it. And also, I think from your stats, I haven't got this bit written down, but I think you compared the statistics you have in your cases versus like the national deaths. And I think, what was it in terms of nationally? Obviously the older you are, the more deaths there are, the higher the age, the more deaths there are. But then, in your stats, it's the opposite. But in the end, you said, that kind of makes sense, and it kind of does when you think about it from this angle. Wow.
Yeah, right. So when you look at the graph of our cases and when the previous person died, they get less as you go across the age range, where of course in the general population it gets more.
And I think for a while, so that was maybe something that people used against the cases at DOPS. I think they said, well, why doesn't it align with the numbers in the general population? But in fact, the fact it doesn't align, it kind of works out in the end. When you step back and look at it, it really seems to fit.
The other part that does align with the general population is the sex of the previous person. So our cases, is more like boys are more likely to talk about past life than girls. And it's about 63%. And 90% of our cases that the child talks about a past life as a member of the same sex. So a way of looking at the question of why more kids, more boys than girls talk about a past life is looking at why do they remember a past life as a male more often than female? And again, it's 63% of the past lives were male. Well, with the database, when I looked into it, I saw that in the natural death cases, it's 50-50, essentially, which is the same in the general population. But in the unnatural death cases, that's where we get more of the male past lives. And it's, I may have been a little off on it when I said 63%. It's 73% of our past lives that died, unnatural deaths, are male. Well, when I looked for information in the general population, I found 5 years of data from the CDC. And for unnatural deaths in the general population, 72% are male. So our cases, if you divide it by mode of death, the stats for male and female match up perfectly with what you would expect if, in fact, this is a sampling of past lives, of lives from the past.
Yeah, that was it. That was one of the things I was trying to recall. There were so many incredible facts and stats in the book that I'm losing some of them and muddling some of them. But that was partly what I was getting at is that split of when you split the genders and you take away you split the unnatural versus natural deaths, and everything all of a sudden seems to make sense. And it seems
right. I mean, that's one that I must say caught my attention. I mean, I was that kind of impressed me. When you see numbers like that.
When you see the breakdown, because it really does. It's like, oh, all of a sudden, is this now logical? Is this now like following the rules? Like, really, really interesting. Really, really interesting. I think that's one of the biggest things that goes in favor of this phenomena. One of the things that I'd most want to say to a skeptic or somebody that was having trouble accepting it, I'd want to show these correlations with the deaths. You also, another thing that majorly caught my attention when going through the book and the stats of your cases was meditation. So you compared the cases in terms of like, is there any correlation with wealth of the previous personality or the religion or various things like that, like how were they a good person or not, but obviously a hard thing to judge. But you went through these various different categories, or however you want to say it, and the only thing that you found that did have a correlation was whether the previous personality was a meditator. And you found that, in fact, not just was there a correlation there between the new personality being a meditator and the previous personality being a meditator. You found the more time that the previous personality committed to meditation, the more strongly the child recalled memories of the previous life. So we actually have that direct correlation between more time spent meditating, more memories recovered.
Yeah, well, I think what the correlation was that the more the person meditated, the more likely the child was to recall memories between lives, to recall going to another realm before coming back to this life. And and now the numbers were pretty small that we had the information on whether they're meditating. But if that's true, it's kind of interesting. So somebody who meditates a lot, does that mean their mind is better able to incorporate events between lives and events in another realm that might, if someone's not a meditator, might just be incomprehensible to them? Or would it mean that someone who meditates a lot is more likely to then have an experience in another realm? Now, again, the numbers are small enough where it's very preliminary, but it's intriguing.
Yeah, very much so. And I thought it was the more meditation, the stronger the case. Maybe I muddled it, but maybe there is overlap, because I think also from your book, when children do have intermission memories of the time in between, they tend to be the stronger cases with more memories anyway.
Right. So, and it's been a while since I looked at those stats, so you may well be right that it correlates.
I hate to correct the author about their own book. I did it to Leslie Kane once or twice. She said, "Oh, you've probably read it a lot more recently than me." So. But yeah, that like I say, as you say, it's very small sample size, but very, very interesting. And I find meditation is a theme that creeps up in these areas, and it seems to be very, very impactful, very influential, and it seems to be the kind of one common theme to various things, like obviously into having more psi experiences and things like that as well. Brilliant stuff. Me and one of my patrons as well, Jeremy, he was, or Jeremy is French. We were wondering about cases of more than one life. So he asked whether you've come across cases like that. I know from reading the book that you have, so I wanted to kind of adjust the question slightly and ask how many, or do you know what percentage, what kind of ratio of your cases the children do remember more than one previous life?
Yeah, I'd have to look at those stats, but it's very unusual. My guess is probably not more than 1 or 2%. And typically what it is, the child will have strong memories of one life and then much more sketchy memories of a second life. So that's where we are. But they can be in either order. I mean, typically it would be the one they remember the most is the most recent, but sometimes they'll describe a brief life in between. I don't know that we have cases where the child remembered two lives and both have strong verification. It's possible we do that. I'm not recalling, but it's usually one is verifiable, but the other one there's not enough detail to verify it.
Yeah, but it's interesting that it happens nonetheless. And I suppose even though there's not really enough detail to verify it, because you've got one that is seemingly verified, it does make it interesting. It kind of, and it probably gives more of a benefit of the doubt rather than, the alternative. So to get into kind of some areas with some more like mind-boggling stuff and harder to nail down, harder to make sense of. But these are kind of the necessary spanners in the works that nature, reality throws at us, just to keep us in check if we're getting too close to unraveling or figuring any of this out. To cases with anomalous dates. So there's the case you mentioned in your book, I think it was when Ian Stevenson researched, it was Yuta in Thailand, who seemed to be the reincarnation of his uncle. I think Yuta was born, and then 3 or 4 months later, his uncle died, and then 3 months or 4 months later, Yuta got ill or had a fever and stuff like that, and then after that seemed to start displaying behaviors and statements and things from his uncle. So could you talk briefly about that case and what you make of that anomalous date case, or anomalous date cases like that?
So anomalous dates is another term that Ian coined, and what it means is that the child was born before the previous person died. And we do have a few cases like that in our collection. The one you're describing, I think, was a case that Jürgen Kyle and I studied, and it is interesting for a couple of reasons. But one was that the child, after you have, and this is typical, the child will seemingly be kind of normal, get very sick and close to death, and then when they recover, then they start seeming to have memories of a past life. And in this case, what happened was that when the child recovered, he had marks on his arm that matched a tattoo that his uncle had gotten. And I think he was, a little older than kind of what you described, but again, I'd have to look back at the case. But so the uncle had started to get a tattoo, and he had these 3 sort of large dots or circles on his arm, and then it hurt so much that he stopped in the middle of the tattoo. But then this kid, he wasn't born with birthmarks, but then after he recovered from this illness, he had 2 of these circles on his arm. And he also talked about being the uncle, and one piece that was kind of interesting was the uncle had a nickname for his little sister, which was this child's mother. And it was translated as, now I've forgotten her name, but little so-and-so. It was a sort of demeaning kind of nickname. Well, the kid was calling his mother that. And we learned that from the grandparents. And then when we asked the mom about it, she started laughing and said, she had to threaten to spank him to get him to stop doing that. And there were other similar things that people talked about that really reminded them of the uncle who died, I think, in a motorcycle accident. So interesting case. And, if you accept it, then you've got the question of what the heck happened here. It's seemingly the uncle's consciousness replaced whatever was there before or came in. And one possibility, again, if you accept the case, one possibility is that consciousness, that newborns or very young children, the consciousness may not be fully set there. And, it's only later that it becomes kind of permanent, or maybe there at all. I don't know, but it seemingly is like when a child is sick, they're more vulnerable, and one consciousness can come in and knock out the one that was there before.
It's pretty wild, isn't it? It makes me think, it's a scary word, but it makes me think of possessions.
Well, exactly. And sometimes when people say possession, they mean possessed by demons, and presumably it's not like that. But where one human spirit knocks out the other one. So it would be very similar, but to possession. And in this case, as far as we could tell, then the new consciousness just kind of took over and stayed there. But there are a couple of bizarre cases that Ian studied where it was back and forth. Those cases get mind-boggling. They're out there even for for us. I mean, but anyway, it happens, but it doesn't happen very often.
I think in one of those cases that you're referring to, it was like a lady that was like in her 30s or something when it started happening. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other one was an older teenager. And actually, I said they go back and forth. One of them, it was a married woman who had this terrible illness, and then when she recovered, she seemed to be this sort of simple country girl who was not educated the way that this woman was, and it was quite an adjustment. You know what? I've got it reversed. It was a girl in the villages, or a young woman, married woman in the villages, who, when she recovered, seemed to be this educated woman who had died previously. And the educated woman would be writing letters to her dad saying, "Please come save me from this." But eventually she acclimated to her new life and settled down with the husband and had more kids. So I guess the story has a happy ending, but it was that was an unusual case. The other one was this teenage girl who clearly had some issues, but anyway, she started going in and out of being this person from like the 1800s, but she gave details that were very hard to explain, that people were able to look up from someone from the 1800s. But she'd have periods of being that person, and then she'd snap out of it and being the current one and kind of go back and forth.
Yeah, I think she maybe, again, if it's the right one, sang like some old songs in a particular dialect of language from that area and time frame and stuff, which is wild. Yeah. Do you see any, again, we're in kind of speculation territory, but do you, and I just want a quick answer, it's not just a nutshell opinion. Do you think there's any potential connection here with like multiple personality disorder? Like, do you think that could potentially be multiple separate consciousnesses?
Well, it can be essentially separate consciousness, but I don't think it's connected to past lives. I think those cases, which we now call dissociative identity disorder, I mean, they're rare, but they show kind of how fragile and fragmented personalities can be.
Yeah, I was thinking rather than the past lives, I guess more overlap with, like when the consciousness comes in during a period of illness or something like that, or like with the older ladies that we were just talking about, where they kind of shared the brain or the body for a little bit, which was with this back and forth thing.
Yeah, I mean, it is still the most impressive. Multiple personality cases are impressive. I mean, the two ones use different eyeglass prescriptions or have different allergies. I mean, all sorts of strange stuff. Yeah. Now that's a very controversial area in general, but it does, etiology aside, whatever caused it aside, I mean, they do essentially function as different personalities.
Yeah, it's wild and fascinating. I need to look into that area more. It's very interesting. There were also some cases, I think I first heard about these from your colleague Bruce, when I first spoke to Bruce Grayson, and he kind of mentioned these when we briefly spoke about children with past life memories, and it kind of straight away I was like, whoa, there's way more to this than I realized, because I think he talked about a case where two children remembered the same past life. There was two children alive at the moment, and cases where one child remembered two past lives that both were alive at the same time. And then I think I do remember coming across them in your book again after that. So just in general, how do you deal with those kind of cases? What do you do with that? What do you do with that kind of conflicting feeling information? Well,
again, it shows that if you accept those cases, that this is not as linear as we would like it to be. It gets complex. With the ones of multiple kids remembering the same life, most of those, one of our colleagues, Antonia Mills, she's retired now, but University of Northern British Columbia, collected a number of those cases, but it was in indigenous communities where the previous person would be someone who was held in very high esteem, and it was communities where they would ascribe a past life to a child on pretty flimsy grounds. So, like, say, based on a dream that the mom had. So those are easier to challenge than our typical cases. So I'm not completely convinced that that is a legitimate or a genuine phenomenon, that two kids are actually remembering the same past life.
Yeah.
But I mean, I haven't studied those cases in great depth, and I know there were some that Tony and Mills, felt were fairly impressive, but they do tend to be weaker than the best cases in other.
Yeah. It would certainly be easier to make sense of the whole thing if they're not authentic, those cases. Right. But yeah, I mean, with everything that I've come across, and I'm sure you feel the same, everything that you've come across, they certainly could be legitimate, even if we're not going to say one way or another with any kind of certainty. So again, one of the small kind of sub chapters within one of the chapters of your book that grabbed me very much so was a story during your wanderings through Asia, about children who remember a past life as an animal. And there was one case in there that I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about. It was a boy called Dalawong, remembering a previous, in fact, he remembered two previous lives, one of them much less detail, as you said earlier, with children who remember past lives as actual humans. He had a brief memory as a deer, and then a main memory as a python. So yeah, if you could kind of talk about that in a little bit of detail, if that's okay, and I guess what were your first thoughts when you first came across that as well?
Right. Well, I mean, there's not necessarily a logical reason why, if people can have multiple lives, why they couldn't have lives as animals, but it's a little unsettling, I think. And I mean, Ian Stevenson said how initially he was not he didn't care for those cases, but then he started documenting them and found quite a few. I think it was around 30, out of the hundreds of cases that he heard about. And my reaction is kind of similar. I mean, first of all, verification becomes rather challenging. Remember the life of an animal. But in the case that you're describing, where he said he was a python, I mean, the child reported specific details about when he died, that he described a particular cave that he was in, and how he got in a fight with a dog, and after the dog killed him, then the dog's owner cooked it and then shared it, the snake meat, with various people, one of whom would later be the child's father. And that when the group broke up, the father seemed like a nice guy, so the boy, the spirit, followed him and then was born into his family. And then a couple of weird things. So then later there was a neighborhood party, and someone who came to the party, this boy started getting very mad at, and said that he was the man who had killed him when he was a snake. And in fact, he said that the man had a snake bite on his back, and in fact, the man did. And then the other piece of the case, which is even stranger, is that this kid was born with a condition called ichthyosis, which caused him to have scaly skin, particularly on his legs, that looked similar to snake skin. So I don't know, it's a wild case. And I mean, the one weakness of it is the verification isn't as strong as we would like. I think there's a newspaper journalist that was the one who documented the part about the neighbor and all that. And journalists get a lot of things right, but not necessarily everything. But it's quite interesting. And yeah, I mean, we do get these reports occasionally of kids talking about having been an animal, and I mean, usually it's hopelessly unverifiable. But sometimes it's interesting. And but the thing is, so in general with our cases, it seems much more likely that memories will come through if it's a sort of similar kind of life, I mean, nearby, both geographically, but also in other ways. So usually the same gender, usually typically in the same country, and sometimes even in the same village or the same family, and almost always tend to be human lives on Earth. Now, once in a blue moon, a child will say they remember life on another planet, but which is obviously unverifiable. But typically for the memories to stay intact, it's something, pretty close to the past life, which may explain why we hear so few animal cases, or it may just be the animal cases are off. And that it is just human transmission.
Yeah. But I guess, like you say, if it's not that they're off, I mean, maybe it's just the human brain in the vast majority of cases doesn't know what to do with those memories. Maybe they're in like a different format. Like, you have to convert file types to send via certain programs or to upload to a certain thing. Maybe it's like that, like the animal memories are not the right file type for our brain. And so,
the right file type or is the right hardware, I guess, for those memories to survive. I mean, the idea that a snake could recognize a person.
It's like you allude to in your book, though. It's not a snake recognizing a person. It's the consciousness that inhibits that snake at that time.
Well, that's right. So it would be this sort of higher self that was in the snake, but also encoding memories more than just what the snake's neurological system was able to.
Yeah. Which when you put it like that, is kind of digestible, because we think that there is, there's plenty of evidence, even if not proof, to suggest that we have memory that goes, that survives the death of the brain, the death of the body.
Well, that's right. And with these intermission memories, I mean, that would be without a physical brain even attached. So that would be a higher self, if we want to use that term, that would be encoding memories. So, I mean, it's possible that it would encode memories from a past life as an animal, and that they would come through.
Yeah. And again, just on that case, I think it was his shoulder to bite. And apparently, if the journalist was correct, the boy touched the man where the bite was, and then he kind of showed, it's here. And I think you said this, but the boy was like trying to kill the man, like at the dinner. He was like trying to attack him or something. You can imagine a young child doing that.
Right.
It's not exactly a threat, but this kid felt allegedly some clear hostility and anger towards this person.
Well, that's right. And then later, as he got older, he would kill snakes himself. And he said because that's such a hard life that he felt like it was person killing to snakes.
Yeah, which is wild thing to think about. But I mean, maybe. And one last thing is that I think maybe still now, but at least when you wrote your book, he would still go and meditate kind of once a week or once a month or whatever at the place where this snake was killed.
Oh, that's right.
In a cave, which kind of adds up with what you said about the memories potentially coming through because it's very close to where the animal was geographically speaking, potentially.
Yeah, right. And he was sort of like considered a natural healer as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Really interesting. Have you come across any other cases of that you felt were at least very interesting or particularly interesting, or have there been none others that came close to being as verified as that one?
Nothing as close as being verified, no.
Yeah. Is it kind of quite a number of ones that come through that are like Peter the chimpanzee that you mentioned in the book, where it's just this totally isolated memory that I think the boy's mum, Peter's mum, gave him a sweetie, a candy necklace, and he goes, a boy threw this in my cage when I was a chimpanzee, and I didn't know what to do with it. And then, life happens, things carry on, and he never says anything about it again. He doesn't remember saying it. He never elaborates. And so it's just this one thing that was either a totally random moment of fantasy coming out for no apparent reason, or a memory that was deep somewhere within this boy that just somehow came up to the top, and somehow he said it at the same... really interesting. And if that happens very often, that kind of thing, which I expect it there's a good chance it happens a lot more often than we have any awareness of, because people wouldn't really report that stuff very often.
Well, that's right. And yeah, there will be something that'll sort of stimulate the child to, in this case, I mean, child imagines that they were a chimpanzee in a past life. An American child says they were a chimpanzee in a past life. That's kind of weird. So yeah, but this candy necklace thing may have stimulated that memory, just like we have one case where the mom was driving down the highway and her toddler, his car seat behind her, pipes up and says, "In my last life, I drove a big truck." That's the only thing he ever said about a past life. Wow. It seemed like there was just this memory got stimulated and then it was gone.
Yeah. And another one, I think, was a young child in your book that was being bathed by a mum. And she said maybe something like, "You didn't used to cry," or "You used to cry when I used to bath you like this," or something like that. Right. And then never referenced again, never talked about it again.
Well, that's right. Just one conversation. We do have some of those that during that one conversation, it can be quite intense where the child is clearly very emotional about it. It's not just this, kind of sing-songy make-believe. I mean, the child is fully involved, but then for whatever reason it passes and then they never go back to it.
Yeah, fascinating. So your last word on what I like to now call interspecies reincarnation. Is it possible? Yes, no, maybe? I'm assuming it's the latter.
Well, is it possible? Possible.
Okay, yeah, that's better. Yeah, that's true. My question gave it there. So let's briefly talk about the Leininger case, James Leininger. I don't want to spend too long on it because obviously I've had a conversation with Bruce and people can watch that, and I've got a few other questions I want to get to. But yeah, just in kind of maybe 5 minutes or so, if you just talk a little bit about that. And one thing I would like you to mention is Michael Suduth. I think he came with some critiques of the case. I don't think too long ago now, in a paper, and you responded with a paper, and I think he responded with a paper, and then maybe you responded again with a paper, and I don't know how many responses there have been on either side. But if you could kind of maybe summarize like what maybe his criticisms were of the case and how you kind of rebutted to that, and I guess ultimately what is your feeling on the case now? Like, what are you still as confident in the case as you were when you first researched it? Just say a few words on that.
Well, to answer your last question first, yes, I am still as confident in the case. So for people who aren't familiar with it, James, at the age of 2, around his 2nd birthday, started having horrible nightmares multiple times a week, in which he'd be kicking his legs up in the air, screaming, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." And then during the day, he would take his little toy airplanes and slam them into the family's coffee table and say, "Airplane crash on fire." And when I saw the picture of the coffee table, there were dozens of scratches and dents from "Airplane crash on fire." Bam. And then not a lot, but there were several conversations where his parents could talk with him about this while he was awake. And he said how he was a pilot who had been shot down by the Japanese, and described basically that his plane had been hit in the engine and crashed in the water, and that's how he died. And said that they would ask him his name and he would just say "me" or "James," and they didn't make anything of that. But they also asked him one time who else was there, and he said Jack Larson. And then later his dad had a book on Iwo Jima, and James pointed out a picture and said, "That's where my plane got shot down." And then the key was, he said how his plane had flown off of a boat, and his parents asked him the name, and he said Natoma. And it turned out that there was the USS Natoma Bay that was involved in the Battle of Iwo Jima during World War II. And they only lost one pilot during the Iwo Jima operation, is this guy named James Houston. And his plane had crashed exactly the way that James Leininger described, got hit in the engine, burst into flames, crashed in the water. And on the day that happened, The pilot of the plane next to his was named Jack Larson. So when you look at the details that are documented that James said before Houston was identified, if you look at all of them, they're all correct or mostly correct for James Houston. So one that's not 100% correct. James said that he was flying a Corsair, which is a special type of plane developed during World War II. James Houston was flying a different plane when he died, but he had definitely flown a Corsair. He was part of the group that tested the Corsair for the Navy. So it was certainly a prominent part of his experience. And then the other part that was not 100% right, James said that it was at Iwo Jima. Well, it was Houston was killed during the Iwo Jima operation. They had a well, it's kind of a long story, but the Japanese, there wasn't an airport they could land at Iwo Jima, so they would land at a nearby island, and then they would have to ship on several boats, small boats, the materials to the soldiers on Iwo Jima. So anyway, one of the missions one day was to hit those shipping things, and that's where Houston went down. But they were all his statements that we have documented were essentially correct. And he made a number of other statements that were correct as well, but we don't have documentation of those, like about family and so forth. But with the ones we have, I mean, particularly once I realized that there was this television interview with the Leiningers that had never been shown, but I had a copy of, that was made before Houston was identified. I said that was evidence of documentation of the child's statements. And so that case got actually more impressive as I looked into it more. And James Houston was from Pennsylvania. I mean, no connection at all to the Leiningers. And of course, he was one of tens of thousands of Americans that were killed during World War II, maybe hundreds of thousands, I don't know, however many deaths we suffered. So Michael Sutter spent a lot of time investigating this case retroactively, and he thinks he came up with, or he says that he came up with these damning details, but he actually didn't. I mean, one thing he showed was that James knew a lot about World War II. I mean, he had been exposed to a lot of information about World War II planes, but we already knew that. And he had his own list of statements, and he said that James, the ones he got right were just general and that not the specific ones, but that's because he took the specific ones off the list. And if you look at the Natoma, Jack Larson, Iwo Jima, and the way that they died, I mean, it's all very specific. It could only apply to one person in the history of the world, and that was James Houston. So I think the case stands up extremely well.
I do think it's a really fascinating case, and I think Bruce comes across as very, an honest person. I don't think he's trying to like scam anybody. And if people, he's written a book about it, right? They wrote a book about it, Soul Survivor. And so some people might think, oh yeah, there's your motivation right there. They got rich off their book. I mean, I don't think they got rich off that book. I mean, I haven't seen their bank accounts, but I know that Bruce still works now. They didn't get wealthy. I mean, it was on the bestseller list for a week, but I mean that, you can't retire when that happens. And I mean, this case had been going on for years before they decided to write it. And I mean, we've got documentation that went on for years before they decided to write a book. So I don't begrudge them that book. I mean, they had this incredible experience to happen. So, nothing wrong with writing about it. And of course, the world we live in, like everybody needs a little bit of money to get by. So there's nothing wrong with, if it works out to make a little bit of money on the side, it doesn't mean all of a sudden that you've made it up just for the purposes of doing that. Anyway, I think it's very interesting, and if anybody wants to learn more about it, please go and check out that episode, and of course read Jim's papers about it and everything like that.
Yeah, and I mean you can. So it's in Journal of Scientific Exploration, which has open access. So anyone can read Michael Sutter's 94-page investigation of the case, and then my rebuttal. And then he responded. And then Jim Matlock is an anthropologist who also knows all this phenomenon very well. He then sort of responded to, I only got one response to Sudduth, but Jim Matlock then carried on the discussion.
Wow. So yeah, if somebody wants to read all that, it's basically a book.
Right. We can publish it as a separate volume. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things about James' case as well, that was really interesting with the dolls. He had 3 dolls and he gave them names, and their names turned out, after the verification of the previous personality, it turned out they corresponded to 3 friends of James that died on board the ship, I think, that he was on, or at least he said they...
Go ahead.
They met him at the gates of heaven, right, when he was going up. And so I was going to lead that on to ask you about intermission memories, because James had these intermission memories. He had those arriving at heaven. He had, of course, the famous, he picked his parents. They were at the big pink hotel on the beach in Hawaii, and he chose them because he knew they were going to be good parents, and all this kind of thing, this mind-boggling stuff. But yeah, what are your thoughts on intermission memories? How common are intermission memories? And what do we, just to kind of pile on a third question, in my multi-question format, what do we make about the fact these cases seem to be stronger overall when they have intermission memories? So yeah, just how common are they, and what are your thoughts, really?
Yeah, so about 20% of the kids will talk about memories of events that took place between lives, after they died in the past life, before they were born in the current one. And the types of memories they describe differ. So some of them will talk about staying near either where the previous person died or staying near the previous family, and sometimes giving verifiable details, like describing, they'll say that they saw their own funeral and giving details and that kind of thing.
Which, just to jump in and interrupt you, sorry, Jim, but it always makes, when we think about that, like them staying around and watching the funeral, it also makes me think about the experimental birthmark cases, when the mark wasn't made for a few days or a week afterwards. Like, that kind of comes to my mind, that they're hanging around their body and they see this and they're like, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, their consciousness could get imprinted because they're still there.
But sorry, please carry on.
Yeah, and some of them describe essentially a near-death experience where they float above their bodies, and then they may encounter other beings and that sort of thing. Some of the American kids will use the word heaven, that they floated up and then they were in heaven, and some will say that they talked with God or communed with God. And then some will describe either picking their next parents, or being guided to their next parents, or watching their next parents. Sometimes giving details that shock the parents, like you mentioned with James, and seeing his parents at the big pink hotel in Hawaii, having dinner on the beach, and which was all true that's when his parents started trying to conceive. They didn't actually conceive until later, but that's when the intention started, and then James described it. If you look at the kids who report these memories, they are more likely to recall more accurate details from the past life, as well as to give more names. So it seems as if kids with more complete memories, that they can include memories from time between lives too. Where there's other kids, some kids just have glimpses of it all, and they're less likely to report things happening between lives.
Yeah, such a fascinating part of this whole thing, part of this whole mystery, isn't it? And the fact that there are these parallels with near-death experiences, like you say, and other aspects too. But yeah, I do really find that fascinating. And there's a few cases in your books about, I think, people that have passed away, they've died, whatever, they're floating around, for want of a better way to say it, and they're at the market and they see somebody that catches their eye or something like that. I can't remember if it's a specific case. I think it is. He sees somebody, he's like, oh, that person looks nice, I'm going to follow him home and going to become their child, and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. There is a case where a guy said that he had lived in the tree above where his previous body.
That was it.
And then he decides he needs to kind of move on. I guess he gets kind of lost in the market, but he sees what looks like a nice man and follows him home. And it's during a rainy day. And it turned out that his future father, his father, in fact, had been in that area during a rainy day at the time when his wife became pregnant. So,
yeah. So fascinating. This question is from another patron. This is from Joe. So I'm going to read it word for word. The median interval between incarnations is 16 months. What is happening during that intermission? Do people experience time in the same way between lives? Does that gap feel instantaneous to them? Or are they going through some kind of process? So do you want me to just recap quickly? Because there was like kind of 4 questions that all kind of mesh together.
Well, it's an interesting question. Yes, the median is 16 months, and the average is 4.5 years. So we're typically very recent lives, but there are exceptions like James Leininger's where it's 50 years. So the kids, I mean, they don't often give the interval. They don't say, I was in heaven for 7 years. Although the kid who's above the tree said he was. I mean, I think it's reasonable, at least in my mind, it's reasonable that space-time, I mean, if you're not in this space-time existence, then time would have a whole different meaning. But I don't know. I mean, there are times where kids will say they didn't think they'd been gone that long. So that would be one where it, not necessarily instantaneous, but where it was a lot shorter. They thought it was a lot shorter than it really was. And again, most of the kids don't report any memories. So for them, it would be like it was instantaneous. So hard
and the ones
definitive answers of what's going on with them time-wise or during.
I know we're in speculation territory. Don't worry. And nobody's going to quote you on this in any journals or anything. This is just, gut feelings and things at this point, I think, when we're at this level. So I think in terms of what they do during those times, it's basically they report just these kind of transcendental experiences, these like mystical experiences that are hard to quantify. It's not so much as like, I went to this realm and did something consistently for like a period of time. It's more just a general spiritual experience that has no way of timing it or anything like that. And as you say, I don't think time necessarily works in that linear fashion, and I think it's a very confusing concept where I could quickly get out of my depth. But there are plenty of elements or plenty of various ways of having some evidence. I worded that horribly, but there's plenty of things that point towards time being more than we understand it to be, like in terms of precognition and presentiment and things like that, which by proving that, which I think Dean Radin and many other scientists have basically done in the lab, it shows in itself, but just that shows that time is more complicated than we can perceive.
And I mean, we know that from Albert Einstein, right? I mean, if passage of time varies depending on the observer, and you get closer to the speed of light and all that. So time is not the immutable, permanent type thing that it feels like it is to us. It's clearly more complicated than that.
And the whole thing where like a clock time will move at a different speed on a clock depending on where it is, like how high up it is or whatever. Really fascinating stuff. What do you speculate? I guess this is a kind of bigger question. What do you speculate is, and you may have kind of given a few little snippets of what you're going to say in your answer, but what would you speculate is the explanatory framework for this phenomenon? Like, how might that look? How does it encompass all of this? What do you think is going on, basically, and how might that work?
Well,
I know you've gave a great breakdown of this in your book, but if you can break it into a nutshell, that would be.
I mean, I think if you accept these cases, there's no way to map them onto just a materialist understanding of reality. What I think they do is sort of provide a glimpse of the fact that it's not a materialist reality that is ultimately, and plenty of people smarter than me have said this, including Max Planck, the founder of quantum theory. Ultimately, I think consciousness is fundamental, and the physical world, or what our perception of the physical world, grows out of consciousness. And with that being the case, I see no reason why consciousness would end when the physical brain dies, because it's the reverse. Not that the brain causes the consciousness, but more that consciousness has produced everything that's physical. So it makes sense to me that an individual consciousness would be sort of part of the larger big C consciousness that is really the foundation of existence.
If you were to speculate with me, do you think that we would, everybody would be forced to reincarnate? Or that it would be more of a choice, or maybe not a kind of actual choice. Maybe it's like certain criteria could have been met or not met involuntarily. Where would you fall? Again, just in speculation, where would you fall on those ideas?
Well, my feeling would be that consciousness continues. So we all have a future existence, but not necessarily here. And I would view it as more of a sort of a naturalistic kind of phenomenon, where whether you come back here or whether you have some other kind of existence is just follows in a naturalistic pattern what has happened here. So again, if you have a sudden death, then the process may make it more likely that you come here, not that some people talk about unfinished business, which is kind of possible, but it's not like somebody chooses, I want to come back, although some of the kids say they did, but I just tend to think of it as more, it just follows where it's going to go. And for some of us that means coming back here. For others it means a different kind of existence.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say some of the children did say they chose to come back, and then you have some NDEs where they're like, no, don't send me back to my body, no, don't, and yeah, go on, right. You're going back. And I suppose, yeah, your answer kind of gives me this already. You don't think it's just reincarnation or bust. You think there's probably a variety of things that could happen. Maybe there's a realm where, like an afterlife realm, maybe you can come back as an apparition. Maybe there's various different things that could or could not happen. And I like the way you say like a naturalistic process. I think that's probably the most likely, is there's some incredibly confusing and nuanced process.
Right, or you could move on to a different
kind
kind of quote unquote physical reality, not this one, but another seemingly physical reality. It's not heaven or the afterlife, it's just a different world than this one.
Yeah. Do you think we'll ever be able to explain all of this stuff and satisfy kind of mainstream science? Do you think we'll ever be mainstream? That might have changed by then, but do you think we'll ever be able to satisfy like the bulk of science, the bulk of scientists? And will it be in the quantum world? Will it be via some quantum explanation, do you think?
Well, I like to say that probably have to wait until my next life for that, or maybe the one after that. But I do think, quantum theory definitely shows that the world doesn't operate the way it seems to in our day-to-day experience. It's a lot more complex than that, and does seem to involve this question of consciousness and observation and how critical they are to this reality. So if we do get where mainstream science accepts it, I think it will be through physics and something like quantum theory anyway, where it not only sort of allows for the possibility that consciousness continues, but that becomes part of the makeup of the theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just to kind of ask another question about your thoughts on after death, like what happens after we die. Do you think, and again, you think it's a naturalistic process, do you think as part of that naturalistic process we would retain like in our higher self, I mean, like our consciousness, not necessarily our body. If we come back here, I don't mean would that next body remember the memories, because as we've seen from your cases, that's kind of hit and miss, and maybe the vast majority of people that get reincarnated don't actually have any access to memories. But do you think, in consciousness terms, do you think we would retain memories, retain personality, and things like that? And obviously the negative side of things, like if we associate a mark on our body with particular trauma or what have you think we retain these things kind of beyond our next incarnation, what have you, just retain them potentially indefinitely?
Well, yeah, I mean, we are speculating, but I think, I think the cases would point in that direction, that it does become part of the higher self. But, personality is tricky because we know that different things contribute to personality, like genetics and environment and all that. So
and it can change during a life on Earth, I suppose.
Absolutely. So presumably it continues to evolve or to change, if it continues on in some way in this other consciousness realm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree as well. But obviously you're much more of an authority on this than me. If I can kind of whip through a few quickfire questions, sure. Maybe I got they were the ones that didn't, I didn't have enough time to squeeze in that many. So these are the ones I couldn't quite leave out. So they were, so maybe we just try and, if you can kind of try and keep your answer to maybe 2 or 3 minutes or something like that. If it's quicker, it's quicker. It's no problem. So the first one is from Jeremy. Are you still actively working on reincarnation cases? And what are some of the most compelling cases that you've come across very recently? I'll kind of add to that and say maybe during the last year or two, have there been any particularly compelling ones?
That we are still studying cases, and unfortunately, more of my time has been devoted to the child psychiatry clinical part recently. But yes, we're still studying cases. There's a very involved case now involving a child with memories of 9/11 that we're still exploring. Wow. So the cases continue to come in.
Yeah. Can you say anything more about that case for now, or is
it's still, it's incredibly detailed and involved, but we've got to put it all together and analyze it before I can say much about it.
When did it first cross your desk? When did you first hear about that?
Well, it was during the pandemic, so it's been within the last couple of years.
And it's still a work in progress.
Yeah.
That would be. Do you think there's much chance that one will go? Do you think you'll be able to go public with it at some point and talk about that? I suppose if you have to change their names, you should.
Yeah. Again, there's some work involved, but hopefully one day we'll be able to write it up.
Wow, because that sounds fascinating and probably chilling. So here's another question from a patron. This is Joe again. So have you heard any reports of some kind of therapeutic intervention that might be applied between lives? For example, a decompression chamber to help the person recover from traumatic experiences or a violent death?
Between lives?
Yeah, so I guess it would be in kind of the intermission memories. A child might say like, oh, I had this process or this thing, or, I don't know exactly. Yeah. I think that's what he's getting at.
No, I have not heard any reports like that. And to be fair, the children's reports tend to be kind of vague about everything that happened. But no organized kind of processing
Yeah. What about in terms of, have you come across any cases of children that display strong past life memories but also have savant syndrome? And are you aware of any, or not aware, I should say, what are your thoughts on there being a potential connection between savant syndrome and past life memories? I recently spoke to Diane Hennessy. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Diane Hennessy. She's a psychiatrist interested in savant syndrome.
We have not had any savants cases talking about past lives, and we haven't had any of our past life cases who appear to be savants. So I don't know if there's a connection there or not.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because these children, they're born and they have these seemingly extraordinary abilities or knowledge, and I think in your book there was a few cases of children that have extraordinary abilities, like a boy who was very, very good at golf, and I think his previous personality was a golfer. Do you remember the name of the previous personality off the top of your head?
Bobby Jones, who was
Bobby Jones. Funny little tidbit for me to mention to you is I heard that name for the first time in my life, at least that I'm aware of, in your book. And within about an hour of reading that name in your book, I went and listened to something on YouTube while cooking, and they mentioned the name Bobby Jones and talked about him for like a minute or something. Like they're like, oh, this great golfer Bobby Jones, and I'm like, no way. Yeah. Literally the first time in 30 whatever years that I heard that name in your book, and like literally an hour later they're mentioning it. So I just thought that was really weird. But yeah, that kind of, for me, there was some potential, at least if not correlation, some kind of like similarity there between the savant syndrome and these kids have these amazing abilities, but maybe just without the memories to go along with it.
Yeah, and I mean, that kid did seem to be close to being a golf prodigy. But I mean, savants, where they and most often autistic, and they have what seem to be superhuman abilities. I mean, mind-boggling stuff. I'm not aware of a connection between that kind of phenomenon, but we do have cases with where the child's skills match the skill from the past life and seem to be out of the norm for what kids would typically have.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, again, just in brief, on announcing dreams and predictions? These are two elements that kind of add to the cases, but I didn't want to go into it earlier because I feel like it's not as directly, I don't know the right word, but it feels a little bit more out there for people, and it's obviously it is a little bit more out there.
So with announcing dreams, there are ones where a member of the family, usually the mother, would dream that somebody comes to them and says, I want to be born into your family. And then that the child is born and then has memories of that person's life. And in a way, an announcing dream kind of weakens the case in the sense that it creates this expectation in the parents that the child was this person who died. And usually it's somebody that the family knew. So it's hard to know what it means. I mean, you can look at it the other way and say, wow, it's incredible that they, the consciousness actually contacted the parent and then came back. But you can look at it either way. With the predictions, those are not common at all. But there are some cultures or some cases where the person would say, I want to be born into that family or something like that, or I'm going to come back in that place. And again, it creates an expectation if it's like a family in the same village. So again, depending on the case, potentially that could weaken a little bit.
Yeah, kind of goes both ways. Like if depending on the case, as you say, very much case dependent. It could strengthen it potentially, and but there's also the element where it takes away a little bit because, as you say, like the expectation and things like that, and they could build this all these memories and stuff. But very interesting nonetheless. Do you know, again, off the top of your head, I haven't given you warning of this, do you know what percentage of your cases or DOPS cases, the children lived close to where their previous incarnation lived? Do you know how common? Because I know that's common, and it's like surprisingly common. It's kind of a bit bizarre, but do you know how common?
I'd have to look up the stats.
Approximately?
Well, as far as sort of total strangers versus known to the family, off the top of my head, I would say 50-50, but I may be way off on that.
Yeah. Okay. I won't quote you on it. But it's quite common, isn't it? Yeah. That the child will remember being somebody that lived within, let's pick up a random number and say within 50 kilometers or 20 kilometers.
Well, that stuff. Yeah. I mean, 50 kilometers. Yeah. I would say it's probably a majority of the cases.
Why do you think that is?
Well, again, it seems like the past life typically is close in one way or another. I mean, geographically or culturally. So for memories to come through, it seems that that's how it happens. Now, again, there are plenty of exceptions to that, like James Leininger. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it does seem more likely in that case.
Yeah, that's true. As soon as you start to feel like there might be a rule, like I said earlier, as soon as you start to feel like, okay, we're starting to notice this pattern here, very strong, you'll get something that just totally throws it off. You mentioned earlier, and I just wanted to quickly follow up with you about it, that we were talking about the gaps between incarnations, and you said, James Leininger, kind of the case doesn't follow the average years and the medians because there's like 50 years or whatever gap. What is, as far as you're aware, the longest gap between incarnations that you have on the books at DOPS?
Well, the hard part is with it being verified.
Obviously, the longer,
I mean, certainly in the Asian villages. I mean, if you say you were living 100 years ago, that'd be pretty impossible to verify that. And even, I mean, with the American ones too, because then you'd really have to go through the right details. And even if you did, it might not be traceable. So, I mean, I'd have to look up what the longest interval is for a verified case. But it's probably not much more than 50 years, just because the information is just not available.
Yeah. And have you got any idea what the longest would be for an unverified case? Just one that you came across?
Well, there are ones where kids like complain about cars and, cars that ruin everything. And so, I mean, I don't know, 100 years.
Yeah. Again, like we obviously have no way of knowing other than to speculate as to whether there is a limit to this. Whether is it possible to reincarnate 2,500 years after you previously passed away, or after that time you're naturally going to be so far away from this realm, whatever, that you can't come back. Yeah, like emotionally or spiritually, or I don't know. But yeah, it's interesting to think about, obviously. I think one of the last questions I'll ask you is just because, again, we were talking about, reincarnation and other ways of surviving, death not being the end. What do you think about like new souls? I don't know how else to word it, but like, has everybody kind of, do they have some kind of history? Has everybody been alive before? Or do you think there are still new soul, new consciousness formed? Or split off from its main body, or however we want to look at that.
Can't say I've given that a lot of thought, but I would say either they are all eternal, or there can be new souls that are sort of bubbling out of the big consciousness and kind of starting anew.
Yeah, the cauldron of consciousness. Or maybe one soul, like when people like have they have two sides of their personality that they start to commit to one side, maybe they split them into two, and then that's who knows? We could speculate for hours on this kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
I love it though. Such fascinating areas. Look, Jim, you've been really generous with your time. I should let you get going, but before I do you have any last words or a message or anything you want to say to anybody that's watched or listened today?
Well, I would just say that we certainly attempt this to be serious-minded work, and I'd encourage people to look into it. And if you think there's nothing to it, then fine. But see what you can make of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you think there's nothing to it after reading the book, I'd love to hear from you, because I'd be interested to have a conversation with somebody like that. I'm not sure how you quite think there's nothing to it after reading the book. Because it is incredibly compelling, and I really do encourage everybody to go and read Jim's books and everything like that. But yeah, thank you again.
Sure.
Greatly appreciated. Really enjoyed it. Fascinating topic, and hopefully we can talk again in the future sometime.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Jim Tucker for having this conversation with me, and thank you for listening to us. I hope you enjoyed it and had your mind open to some new possibilities. Please see the description for relevant links and more, and if you enjoy our interviews, please subscribe to continue unraveling the universe with us. If you want to support us with a small monthly donation, please consider doing so via Patreon. Thank you.